Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Melissa Begg, and I have the great honor of being the Dean of the Columbia School of Social Work. We're delighted to welcome today's distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Sean Zhou, as the inaugural speaker in a new Dean's Lecture Series on the scholarship of race and racism. The series, featuring prominent scholars in this area, has been created to highlight research that examines and promotes the well-being of Black Americans. We are thrilled that Dr. Zhou will kick off this series. I'm grateful for this opportunity for our community to come together to explore the major nodes and intersections in the complex systems of racist structures and policies that result in inequities, with a particular focus on disparities in economic opportunity, educational outcomes, criminal justice, healthcare access, and wellness. I'm really looking forward to this first discussion. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's moderator, a truly amazing colleague and also beloved faculty member and mentor here at CSSW, Dr. Desmond Patton. Dr. Patton is Associate Professor of Social Work and Associate Dean for Curriculum, Innovation, and Academic Affairs here at the school. His research interrogates pathways to violence, both online and off, in unique ways. He takes a really innovative approach using qualitative and computational data methods to study how and why violence, grief, and identity are expressed on social media, and the impact these expressions have on well-being among low-income youth of color. Dr. Patton is a member of Columbia's Data Science Institute, where he was recently appointed as its Associate Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. At our school, Dr. Patton has played leadership roles with a number of exciting initiatives, including the SAFE Lab, AI for All, and the Action Lab for Social Justice, as well as many others. And just last week, Dr. Patton welcomed the second cohort to the User Experience Research Lab, a fellowship program designed to support formerly incarcerated citizens' access to tech as a career. Dr. Patton, it's a pleasure to turn it over to you and our esteemed guest.
Thank you so much, Dean Begg, and good evening to everyone. It is such a great honor to be able to welcome my mentor, Dr. Sean Zhou, to Columbia Social Work. Dr. Sean Zhou is a nationally recognized authority on suicidal behavior among Black Americans, and is expanding the evidence base for effective practice with Black boys and young men. His research focuses on Black adolescents' mental health service use patterns, the role of religion in Black suicidal behavior, salivary biomarkers for suicidal behavior, and development of father-focused, family-based interventions to prevent urban African-American adolescent males from engaging in multiple forms of self-destructive behaviors. Working within the Center for Social Development, Zhou has launched the Race and Opportunity Lab, which examines race, opportunity, and social mobility in the St. Louis region, working to reduce inequality in adolescent transition into adulthood. The lab leading community science project is Homegrown St. Louis, which is a multi-systemic place-based capacity building intervention to enhance upward mobility opportunities and health of Black males ages 12 to 29 years old in the St. Louis region. Zhou's epistemological work focuses on the concept of race in medical and social sciences. He serves on the steering committee of the National Suicide Prevention Resource Center and the National Advisory Council of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Forward Promise Initiative. In recognition of the impact of his work, Zhou was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare, the Society for Social Work and Research, and the New York Academy of Medicine. And just a quick personal note, I've known Dr. Zhou since 2004, when we both came to Michigan. He was a newly tenure track professor and I was an MSW student. And it was amazing to have this full circle moment with him today. Dr. Zhou, we welcome you.
Good evening, everyone, and hopefully you can see me. I want to thank Dean Melissa Beggs for this invitation to be a part of this lecture. I want to thank Desmond. I'm just so honored to see his career blossom in the way it has. He's always had wonderful ideas, and now he's making them into reality, not just for himself, but for others for whom this work is informing policy and strategies. So I'm very excited about that. So Desmond, again, thank you for this kind introduction. And colleagues and friends I've known over the years that is at Columbia School of Social Work, as well as those who are attending. Again, I thank you for your time this evening. And I'm hoping that we can engage in a conversation centered around this issue of race. And I'm hoping that we can frame it in a way that I'm hoping it's not too boring. It's around methodology, but I did not plan to use a lot of formulas or those sort of things. A little bit of background about the Race and Opportunity Lab. So we begin to examine what we mean by race. We begin to examine what we mean by opportunity and how those things combine to impact social mobility. And for me, it's primarily with Black boys and young men. And the lab does a lot of different things, but I'm going to bring us into this conversation that began with my journal club. So the focus of my talk is about the importance of ending racialized methodology in social work science. Ending racialized methodology in social work science. So I want to put this in context because, again, nothing I think began by itself. We're always building off of previous leadership and work. And I want to acknowledge that race as America's grand challenge was articulated in the January 2016 Society for Social Work and Research plenary address by Dr. Larry Davis, and who's now the professor and dean emeritus at the School of Social Work at University of Pittsburgh. And Dr. Davis really used this moment to kind of summarize a body of work that began in his tenure from the 1970s well up into 2016, always examining this issue of race. And he makes a couple of points I want to highlight to put some context around my discussions today. And he says, as social work researchers, we are at risk of losing our significance in haste to find significant levels or statistical significance. The point is that social work began and always been a profession of applied workers trying to have impact. And as we have matured in terms of our science, we're at risk for losing ground for having relevance. And he framed this to begin to engage us in a discussion about race as America's grand challenge, something that we have to continue to still tackle. So he said, therefore, let us work to ensure that social workers are not viewed as just another group of uncaring scientists or practitioners, but as a group whose research is committed to bringing about social justice. Thus, the end of our work should be to see significant and transformative change. He issued a call to action for social work scientists. He says social work researchers are the best positioned of any researchers in America to make enormous contributions to ameliorate racism in America. And he makes that point, and hopefully you guys can see these slides, and if not, someone let me know. He says a few things. He said we're losing our way or potentially can lose our way because the conversation has shifted or obscured the discussion about race and racism, centered around discussions and celebration of diversity. He says celebrating diversity is okay, but celebrating diversity would never eliminate racism in the United States. He said a focus on diversity circumvents historical facts and present-day injustice. He says, consequently, we tend to have solutions that are not significant or does not result in transformation. He says, for example, he cites a study showing that millennials tend to explain or equate individual level culture and perspectives with the idea of diversity, meaning that they don't even talk about race or racism in the same way. And this gives rise to President Trump and others like him who would regard white supremacist demonstrations like in Charlotte's as being a contest between good people on both sides. The idea is that this kind of conversation around diversity doesn't allow us to be sharp in our critique. It doesn't allow us to be focused in our understanding of what the challenges here are in the United States. And it leads to poor and inadequate solutions. Again, there's literature that Dr. Davis cites that says that in a homeowner's intervention using the rubric of diversity failed to alleviate displacement of low-income Blacks and Latinos or Latinas. The point is, again, when your explanatory model is one about just celebrating the unique differences and everyone has a perspective, it really obscures the history of violence that's associated with racism and the consequences, not just for those who are targeted or the targets of that violence, but those who perpetuate it or tolerate it. So he recommends a few things that as social work scientists and as faculty at schools of social work, we are best positioned, as he says, among many in America to advance the efforts to eliminate racism in our society. And I actually believe that. And he said this for a couple of reasons. One, we're among the most ethnically diverse scientific workforce that's out there, which provides us with greater intuitive and experiential as well as factual insight that can help us to understand how can you eliminate racism and the inequality that results from it. He also said one of the natural resources of schools of social work is that we have boots on the ground that's rooted in communities of all colors and class. So that again provides us with a dissemination advantage. Then he finally says the legacy of racism. Our scholars, particularly in the American experience, are uniquely able to address because there are very few social work scholars that do not touch upon many of the social problems and ills that affects our society. So then we're uniquely positioned because, again, the diversity or the range of what topics our faculty are studying and advancing science in is broad. So I pick up this conversation that Dr. Davis left us with here. And he recommended that too often social work faculty or faculty at schools of social work, probably the last time that they really got any training and content around race and racism was probably in their master's level program or undergraduate program. We must require that doctoral training include a course on this issue of race and racism. And he makes the argument saying it's like training a medical doctor but failing to teach them about the heart. We address many of the social issues and social problems in American society, and how can we address or even study those things if we do not attend to racism in the work, racism related to the phenomenon that we're studying. So one way we can move this work ahead is to define excellence in social work science by evaluating how rigorously a researcher attends to racism in their work. We must design our studies and dissemination strategies to focus on influence and policy that can lead to disparate outcomes or inequality. So I want to pick up where Dr. Davis left off and to connect that to this issue of race and racism and the implications for science, teaching, and service among the professorate. And it began in this early phase in 2014 when I created the Journal Club on Race and Science. And we met bi-weekly for 90 minutes in a kind of seminar style with anyone who was interested in joining us for this extra discussion. And I met with students, primarily doctoral students, and one or two faculty from across the campus that decided to come and meet with us. And we began by reading Thicker Than Blood: How Racial Statistics Lie by demographer and outstanding scholar Tukufu Zubiri, who's at the University of Pennsylvania. And I remember when Tukufu gave me this book, I was a postdoc. I was, just trying to grasp all the knowledge I can. But I didn't really get a good sense of what the argument was until I picked it up again in 2014. And this was at the height of the uprising here in St. Louis relative to the killing of Michael Brown. And then I got into this and we started to discuss these very rich and important conceptual issues. So for today, I'm going to provide an overview of the origins of the concept of race. I want to kind of raise our understanding a little bit about scientific racism. I'm going to discuss my recommendation for a moratorium, the use of the word race for describing human differences or diversity. And I'm going to talk about some sound scientific practices going forward. And we can talk about the implications for science, teaching, and service. And for many, we're talking about eventually how does this show up in the lives of everyday Americans, particularly the recommendations that are based on our scientific findings. So let's open this up. And I have a young daughter, so I'm very much always reflecting on the simplicity but yet impactful ways that sometimes Susian craft or language is used. So the idea that people are people. I was trying to explain this concept of race to my daughter because she does ask about it. Not in the same way, but she just says, "Daddy, I love our skin color. Daddy, I love our hair, and my friends are different." So it's her way of bringing this up. But I wanted to kind of bring us into this conversation with the origins of race as a concept. This is it ideology or objective science? And overwhelmingly, race is an ideology. It's not objective science as it relates to human beings. So, what is race? Often we think about race as a noun, right? Each of the major divisions of humankind is one way it's talked about, having distinct physical characteristics. Or we see it in the dictionary as a group or set of people or things with a common features. Or in biology, a population within a species that is distinct and in some way represents subspecies. And we talk about ideas of race that it's century old. It's an attempt to kind of systematically or systemize racial divisions. And again, you got to really think about it. Race, as we now understand it, is really a 19th century concept. Although we think it's centuries old, it's really, in terms of the use of the term race, it's really a 19th century concept. But theories of race assert a link between skin color and intelligence, and these things have been discredited for a long time. However, science still accepts these artificial subdivisions and discussions about races. Science also accepts that genetic variation between individuals, quote unquote, of the same race can be as different as those between members of different races. Another way of saying there's more variation between Desmond and I than it is between Melissa Beggs and I. But where do these things originate? I want to take us back there. So there was a birth process to this culture of hate that's associated with racialization of individuals. So dehumanization occurred in practices occurred in the 15th century. I'll get into that, which led to the creation of the concept of race or application of the concept of race to human beings. In the 17th century, that led to racism and the notion of a white superiority, this lie, and then the terrorism that's used to enforce white superiority perceptions or racism. That led us to systemic racism, where then racism is codified into culture and practice or law. That led us to today's time. So to begin with, I want you to engage in a thought experiment with me. I want you to close your eyes for a second and take 3 deep breaths. Just keep your eyes closed for a second, take 3 deep breaths. Then I want you to repeat after me 3 times. I want you to say, "My race is," and say what your racial identification is. So for example, my race is black. My race is Caribbean black. My race is, so I want you to say that 3 times to yourself. Now, normally I would want to ask, and I would ask someone to unmute, maybe Desmond, if you don't mind, and I would like you to engage with this thought experiment with me for a second. So my race, would you say my race is?
My race is black.
Okay. Tell me how you feel when you say that.
I feel empowered. I feel strong.
Great. All right. So now let's think about this. Now I want you to replace the word race, and I want you to use subspecies. So you say my subspecies is?
My subspecies is?
And say your racial classification.
Black.
So could you repeat that 3 times?
My subspecies is black. My subspecies is black. My subspecies is black.
All right. Tell me how you feel. What are you thinking emotionally? What's your reaction to that?
Ooh, weird. That was uncomfortable. I felt degraded. I felt off.
Now, here's the interesting thing. Race is a synonym for subspecies. Subspecies is a synonym for race. So in biology, where this term emanates from, that's the way, when they look at races among living things, it's looking at subspecies among a group of living things. Subspecies of birds, subspecies of plants, subspecies of apes. So when we use this term race, we're really arguing that we are subspecies of human beings and of modern human beings. Thank you, Desmond. And if you look at the definition of race, pick whatever dictionary you have, pull it up on your phone or your iPhone or your Android, whatever you have, and you will see the definitions. Race, a breeding stock of animals, a family, a tribe, people, nation belonging to the same stock, a breed, okay? A category belonging to the same type. So if you're comfortable with racializing yourself, you should be comfortable in understanding yourself as a subspecies. Now, why is it that we speak in that way? How is it that we start to accept this idea that we are subspecies of human beings? And we've all been guilty, including myself. Let's go back a little bit to understand how we begin to classify living things. So it began with a framework called the Great Chain of Being. And this was based on religious thinking and religious thought that everything should be classified in some type of order. And this is kind of a monotheistic framework. And the idea is that at the bottom is the worst thing, or hell, and at the top is some deity or God, if you believe in God. And then everything else goes from the lowest all the way to the highest. The lowest all the way to the highest. So this is how we used to classify things, and that was the primary way. Again, you're talking about 1579, in those early years, post-Enlightenment period, or part of the Enlightenment period, or leading to the Enlightenment period, I should say, that we classify living things according to this idea of how close is the thing perceived to be to God. So thus, it was a very subjective explanation. Right? And then emerged the classification of human differences and social class, and which gave rise to the birth of whiteness. And this began primarily in Europe. And I'm covering quite a bit here, folks, so I'm just going to move fast and fairly quickly. And there were major theorists, whether it was Thomas Hobbes, 1518 to 1679, English professor of philosophy, again, wrote Leviathan in 1651, argued that people were naturally wicked and could not be trusted to govern themselves. The idea of democracy wasn't even born yet or even fully practiced. It meant that there were noble classes and then there were those who were non-noble, means that, again, it was done to maintain social class among Europeans. So not all Europeans were white. It was a select group of nobles and those who were descendants of those nobles. And then they grouped everyone else. Okay? So a Hobbesian view, again, made this pretty clear. There was something invidious in the spirit of man that again, leads him to war. And we have a proclivity for engaging in war, is what Hobbes was saying. And from this sort of view, inequality in society by social class is inherently going to be a product of what human beings do. And that hierarchy is natural, and this is the trick, and ordained by God. Some groups are noble and superior and have more than others, commoners who are inferior. So it didn't begin with colorism. It began with class and this idea that some groups are more superior than others. Then you bring in this Hobbesian view and this European mindset, which lead many to be primed for the eventual invention of race and for the creation and maintenance of class or caste, as Isabel Wilkerson would frame in her book, Caste, that caste means that there's a hierarchy of belonging, and then from a Hobbesian view, it's ordained by God, so thus, who are you to if you believe in this kind of religious orthodox view, who are you to change what God has put in place? So this was the prevailing thought, leading in to the early classifications of human differences and this early concept of race. Then it moved from these very religious scholars into the naturalist. And many of them came in, like Carolus Linnaeus in 1735, and they began to try to categorize living things. And eventually they sought to categorize, using those methodology to categorize human beings based on anatomy and phenotype and personality and geography. So they wrote these books, and he divided human beings into 4 species: Americanus, Europaeus, Afro, and Asiatics. So again, and he argued that Afro and Europaeus did not have the same origin. So then he suggests that the origins of those from the continent of Africa was very different than the origins of the species from those in Europe. So again, you begin to see this early invention of racial classification. So human beings were represented a category of animals, but were not superior to other animals in that time. But again, he said these ideas about subjugating human beings to this level of different hierarchy did not fit with the growing and strong Orthodox Judeo-Christian views and practices of the time. So again, how do you treat others when Christian principle says you do not treat others as less than? So the thought was then to move the discussion of human difference away from religious subjectivity to scientific objectivity. And this established a paradigm within which research on racial diversity would be conducted. And this work continues. Frederick Blumenbach wrote in 1775 his Handbook of Natural History, and then the racial classification based on anatomical, physical, and cultural characteristics really began to take foot, expanding the earlier work of Linnaeus, and then created 5 categories of human classifications, and invented the term Caucasian relative to the Caucasian Mountains, which at that point still including Asia and South Asia. This work moved forward, and again, it became to be the framework that was guiding, all right, how mankind view each other in diversity. Argues that all humans were one species with breaks in that continuum, which suggests that, again, we had different origins. Although we are all humans, there are very different types of humans. Now, Blumenbach was explicit against using this kind of anthropological way to promote discrimination. He sought to not have it applied to humans to result in discriminatory practices. But again, taking a Hobbesian view, the idea of power, resource, and privilege was central and colonization was central to the European experience. So Blumenbach's thought about not promoting discrimination was quickly pushed to the side, and history proves that. So let me move this along real quickly in another context. So we sought to see, we began to see after this enlightening period, a period of reasoning, which is 1685 to 1815, but within that was the birth of American slavery, which began formally in 1619, but was happening before that. There was a period where ideas of freedom for all, democracy, and citizenship, all these things were very popular during this time. But again, whites wanted equality across social class for other whites. Morally, they could not justify white enslavement, because you got to remember, in the birth of slavery, there was indentured servants, there were slaves, and even slaves who can be born free prior to 1619 and after 1619. But again, for economic reasons, the push was to eliminate white enslavement and to prolong, and not to prolong indentured servitude, but to keep African enslavement, with the argument that, again, that there are they have a different origins in terms of their species of human beings, but more important was to placate and to begin to bring in the greater masses of whites who are immigrating from Europe to the United States, which tends not to be from the higher noble classes, and they have to appease that group and to give them a class stature that was above blacks. Very intentional, and we can get more deep into that. But again, all of this is still motivated by economics, because of the wealth that African enslavement represented to those who could now not just enslave, which was a new idea, enslave for life was the new idea. And have their descendants enslaved was a new idea. That wasn't operating in 1619. That happened afterwards when the decision was made by those in power. So many scientific pursuits were motivated by findings, ways to justify enslavement of Africans. Many scientific pursuits were motivated by that, but then couched in the concept of objective knowledge. And I want to bring to your attention, for those who don't know or might know, many of our statistical methods used today was born out of this historical context. Let me bring us quickly to that. So again, to summarize, the great chain of human beings was the way we used to think about diversity of living things. African slavery starts in America in 1619. Then there was earlier writers and scholars that brought us well into the American Revolution, and the establishment of our way of thinking about caste and the concept of race as applied to human beings. And again, during this time, there was great debate and talk about equality of man. But again, the rationalization that many use to continue to enslave Africans in that brutal and vicious way was to suggest, based on what they feel were the leading scientific thoughts, that these were different groups of human beings and not equal to whites. So again, the modern classification began to take hold in 18th century, and race differences was justified, as I said, but the use of the term really emanated well after that. I want to move past that because that'll take more time. I think I'm going to run out of time. There's a lot I wanted to say here. So you have a lot of these philosophers and scientists, leading thought leaders from Lamarck, and according to Lamarck, again, looking at these phenotypical phrenology sort of methodology, measuring lips and foreheads and skin and height, that those humans, according to Lamarck, those humans who do not adapt and progress can be deemed lowly or inferior. So that means if you were not exercising power through violence and conquering and war, you were deemed as lowly and inferior. And race was used as an indicator of either progress or primitivism. That brings us into the era of Charles Darwin and his important work. But again, you got to think about the motivation of these scholars. So Darwin left us with this idea that the grade of civilization was the most important element in the success of nations. And to preserve the best grade of civilization, we must promote the advances of the superior races. Herbert Spencer picked up this work, and like many of his time, he advanced the term survival of the fittest. It wasn't Darwin, it was Herbert Spencer. And again, and the birth of an area of science to focus on, again, the survival of the fittest and the most superior races. And that science was called eugenics. And eugenics is as they would say in this image, is the self-direction of human evolution, suggests it's natural selection, and only the most fittest should be able to survive. And they sought to show that this was a very objective, humane approach to human society and how it should be formed. So you have all these ideas of social Darwinism, and that's what Spencer brought about, the idea of applying from the biology, Darwinism, to social Darwinism and the idea of survival of the fittest. So those who are inheriting the world should be the most superior, and that's indicated by those who are in the hierarchy socially at the top versus those who are at the bottom. And in all of this, the simple idea here is that make African be at the bottom, no matter what. No matter where you come in to this picture, particularly in American society, being black and of African descent says that you are at the bottom of the caste. And this was done in the context of the idea of advancing anthropological science, which led us to these very eugenicist, white supremacist ideas, which led us to these centuries of racism, all right? And 246 years of chattel slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow and segregation, 25 years of mass incarceration. And we're still seeing the legacy of that today. And the impact of this sort of racism and caste on American society, particularly Black Americans, is significant. Blacks have higher stress, high levels of psychological and emotional distress, higher hypertension, in some places higher anxiety, greater numbers of low preterm or low birth weight deliveries, increased symptoms of depression, poor academic performance. We can go on. So we're still suffering from this work, which began out of this kind of racialization of human beings, first to promote economic means, but then to institute a caste system, a hierarchy of human beings, and to enforce that with violence, and in some case near genocide. So let me bring it to context again for us as social work scholars, and the rise of racial statistics. And this idea of scientific racism now operates in the 20th and now into the 21st century. So as you know, statistics is an important part of our work. So the objective of statistics is that we should be able to collect, preserve, diffuse information about the different departments of human knowledge. Not a bad thing, right? But I want to bring up some of the founding fathers of statistical approaches and their association and motivation for advancing eugenics thinking and science. So let's deal with Francis Walker, renowned economist, statistician, again, was the superintendent of the census, collecting data on those in the United States. Very important part of our Constitution, very important task. But he had a very important idea that he says, call it the Black disappearing hypothesis, argued that without slavery, they said that Black would disappear. And again, you're talking about 1891, you're talking about after the Emancipation Proclamation. Important ideas, but again, trying to make the argument that his hypothesis that the genetic deficiencies rendered Blacks unsuitable for survival in an industrial society, and that no justifiable policy could alter that trajectory. Some of you have come to this idea as biological determinism, that based on your biology and genetics, no social policy can change the outcomes for Blacks. So why focus on equity in schooling because Blacks can't learn as good as whites? Why focus in equity in housing or business because Black can't run businesses as good as white? They're genetically deficient. These are the ideas of these leaders. Okay, I'm not arguing that human diversity statistics are inherently bad. They're not. Their use, application, and interpretation can be harmful. But more important, I'm bringing to light some of these innovators and what motivated them to advance the statistical approaches that we currently use in our science. This is important, again, picking up on Davis's point that if we're going to teach a new generation of scholars to be anti-racist related scholars, you must provide them with a history and knowledge so they can understand their craft. And I'm seeking to do a little bit of this today. So Sir Francis Galton, who coined the term nature versus nurture, the idea that, again, some people are born into the hierarchy and cannot be more than that, nature, biological determinism, and should not survive above the superior race. and that nurture, the idea that we see the differences between, say, blacks and whites, is not because nurture, meaning that you can do something in policy and opportunity and context, is because of their nature. But he was particularly important because he makes this claim: no more than there's equality between man and man of the same nation is there equality between race and race. Meaning, again, whites and blacks cannot be equal because they're not naturally equal. And the idea of Eugene, which comes from the Greek word, means well-born, of good stock, or of good noble race. And science, so eugenics is like the science of the noble race. And how do you ensure that? How do you ensure that in the effects of reproduction and given the physical environment? And these things are not just these are not philosophical things. They were translated into policy. And there were think tanks like the Pioneer Fund, which still exists today, the National Science Council, leading scholars from Harvard and everywhere, really advancing these eugenics idea and supported this level of thinking. And what did that mean? So they had buildings set up for this. This is how they sterilize the lower classes, these eugenicist buildings. Margaret Sanger was caught up a lot in this work as well. So 3 principles of eugenics ideology that I want to bring us to, and many of you know this because you've seen this showed up, but you didn't know it was eugenicist ideology. The unchangeable biological basis of race. That means, again, nurture cannot change anything. People have their nature, it means genetically, and it's transmitted through heredity. Heredity is the basis of all physical, mental, moral, and behavioral characteristics. So people will be who they are. You cannot change them. So our policy should not be trying to focus on that. And then the biological evolution is superior of the European race. These are the 3 basic principles of eugenics ideology. Do you see some of this showing up today? The unchangeable biological basis of race. Everything is passed on through heredity or genetics. And then again, whites are superior, period. So this form of scientific racism continued. There were journals created. If you look through the history of different American journals and societies, even the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences, all of them were somewhat caught up in this sort of early eugenicist thinking at the turn of the 20th century. Let me bring it to some of the statisticians. Carl Pearson, Robert Fisher, and Neiman. I just want to bring up these few because many of you know some of these individuals because you used their techniques. Galton created the concept and advanced the work of correlations or correlations, right? Because he was trying to study human intelligence and show that whites are statistically more intelligent than non-whites. Carl Pearson, many of you know his work, the Pearson correlation coefficient. He was motivated to show it again that they're inferior races, and he wanted to be able to measure with goodness of fit the differences between races to show again that whites are superior. So he helped advance the chi-square statistics. Ronald Fisher, analysis of variance, maximum likelihood. My main point with all of these scholars and their awards and their names, and it still exists today, they were motivated by eugenicist thinking. And that was their primary goal. I'm sorry I'm going a little long, so I'm going to move this up a little bit. So these eugenicists and eugenicist thoughts has implications for us. So normally if I was teaching and I would say, let's make sure we educate our scholars, I was asking what's the implications of all of what I've shared, and I would ask you to think about that. But let me say we can move towards a new analysis of understanding human differences. So how do you use race, right? So it's complicated. And you can think about it like this. One, you should understand that even in the age of genetics, there is not enough variation between people of quote unquote same skin color, right? There's not enough differences between them and people of another skin color. So the concept of subspecies is not scientifically sound. However, we still use this language of race. For example, in the US, a black mother cannot have a white baby, but a white mother can have a black baby. A black mother cannot have a white baby, Well, how can a white mother have a black baby? Meaning, if a black woman marries a white man and have or dates a black man, a white man and have a baby, why can't that be a white baby? But if a white woman procreate with a black man, it's a black baby. So again, these things are artificial. It's more folklore. It's not science, and it's instituted through hierarchy and racial reasoning as the cause. Okay, so I'm suggesting that we have to at least stop for a period of time in using this sort of racial reasoning, again, because it's not scientifically sound. And although we tend to prove this and you know it, and we talk about it as a social construction, it is a social construction, but don't get caught in the trick or what Field and Fields called a racecraft. That the idea is that the effort was to prove this based on biological data, couldn't be proved. So then the effort then is to prove it on social data. Well, if you construct inequality and then use that inequality to prove that there's inherent inferiority in a group, then you're going to get what you construct. So to understand that there are differences between blacks because of education, well, if you say that blacks could not be educated and they were punishable by death, and then you give them inferior supports to build the right education experiences and intergenerationally, and then you still see some differences, although there are those who be contrary to your norm, why are you going to expect that now you're going to explain everything as if blacks are not smart enough to learn? That's why they still have low levels of education. No. There are terms that you can use to describe human diversity, like ethnicity. That means you can understand culture, skin color, geography, behaviors. That is not racializing language. That's understanding, according to the concept of ethnicity, and different variations among human beings. So I do think we have the right terms, but we hold on and we play with this idea of talking about, well, race/ethnicity. No, let it go. Let it go. Let the racism eugenicist idea go. There's sound scientific principles. We can understand skin color. There's variations in skin color. What does that mean? We can understand racism. This is how you racialize people and how you treat them. So it has history, and it's much more something that we can understand between colorism and racism and violence. You can measure that, but it's not race. It's racializing groups, and then it's the racism, the violence that's used to maintain that caste system. So we also have to struggle to make sure we're interpreting the statistics that they say are racial statistics or racial stratification. Again, race as a variable cannot be a cause and must be framed within its appropriate historical and social context. So again, that's something we can talk about. And then it has implications to how we teach diversity, how we teach inequality, and the way we use that science to, again, continue to perpetuate the idea of racecraft, as Fields and Fields would say. And it has implications to, again, how we describe the human services that we are providing and the care that we're providing to individuals, because that's informed by the science. There could be standards that we set in our journals around use of these terms and what does it mean to incorporate them into our science. My main point is race is the witchcraft of our time, as Montague, the evolutionary biologist, who said this in the 1920s. And we continue to be suffering from this. So free your mind. And it's a practice that's not going to be easy. And I look forward to the discussions.
Dr. Joe, thank you so much for that thoughtful and robust presentation. I have to say it's the first time that I've heard a social work scholar present this deeply critical historical view on race and its implications for social work science. So thank you so much for that contribution. Please use the Q&A for questions. I have some questions, and I'll also take some from the Q&A as well. But just to kick us off, the scholar Ruha Benjamin from Princeton always talks about this idea of race being productive as a technology tool, and it dovetails nicely with your historical analysis of race and science. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about what you see as the promise of using history and context for social work science and practice? What does it mean for our research? Do we need to disrupt research practices and methodologies? What does it mean for how we teach students? What does it mean for mandated reporting, as some of our students from Columbia have been lobbying for us to think about very carefully today? So what are your thoughts there?
Well, what I was trying to say to close, and I know I ran through that fairly quickly, is that there's some practical implications. One, that if we're going to understand human diversity, let's measure it in the most scientifically sound way. And that means you're not using the term race. You can use ethnicity. You can use a lot of different things. So even if you're referring conceptually to, say, the Black people, you're not talking about their race. You're talking about their ethnic social identity, and you can be specific about that. Two, it has implications for how we collect our information. So if you're creating demographic information, race is not an appropriate concept as a demographic variable. It's not. So if you understand what race means, as I explained early on, subspecies, well, how many subspecies of human beings are there existing at this time? That leaves you with a binary variable. So there's some practical ways. And again, we're stuck for a period of time because we need to be able to identify the most vulnerable in our society. And I say we can still do that. We can be able to identify them, label them, have cultural heritage, but that's your ethnic heritage. That's your social identity heritage. That's not your racial heritage. It's not your subspecies heritage. It's not. So there's some practical things that we can do to advance our society, and we all suffer from it. It's not going to happen overnight, but because scholars know, and they say the same thing in the same breath, race is socially constructed, and let me talk about it in racial terms. The greatest win eugenicists have had was to make us culturally adopt and use as ubiquitous the concept of race. Because they couldn't prove it scientifically, they did a campaign. It was actually a campaign to get us to use it.
Wow. Oh, yeah.
Both
Absolutely.
progressives and conservatives are doing the same thing.
Wow. Thank you for that. One of the questions that has just come in is, with race being a synonym for subspecies, is this why white people see themselves as raceless?
Well, it's kind of interesting, is that, and one scholar, again, we're reading this book called Racecraft, and it's still, it's an interesting thing that race, and they argue this point too, is only often applied when you talk about Africans, those of African descent. It's that it doesn't apply in the consciousness of whites. It's not that, because they're like, that has nothing to do with us. Race only applies often to those who are non-white. And tells you the psychology, the cancerous psychology that's been adopted or now accepted. It's so much to the point that we don't even really, it doesn't even pass, require the full gaze of many. This is why you get into challenges when those who are saying, well, why you keep bringing up this race thing? I'm not bringing up the race thing. I'm bringing up the racism thing.
Excellent. Next question is, wondering what thoughts there are around how to decolonize research methodologies within the academy.
No, my point is real simple at this point. I think we just have to be rigorous in describing human diversity and to be specific as possible. So if you want to talk about different populations and their social identity and ancestry and geography, then say that. If you want to talk about Haitian Americans, say Haitian Americans. If you want to group them together, I don't mind the term Black Americans, but that's an ethnic and that's an ethnic identity term that I think is useful, and you can support that with sound science. So I think you gotta learn how to simply just practice instituting a moratorium on racializing human beings. You don't need a whole lot of science for that.
Yeah.
If I ask everyone and I ask them, when's the last time you said my race, these races, Yeah. We do it often. It's in our everyday practice.
Dr. Joe, how do we operationalize this, right? So in the audience, we have practitioners, we have lecturers, we have supervisors of MSW students who are all trying to think about what does it mean to engage in anti-oppressive and non-biased approaches in their social work engagement. Do you have any thoughts for how they might leverage this history for that engagement?
So again, I'm proposing more rigorous methodology and on one simple thing. How do you begin to capture information about human beings that allow you to know differences in experiences among human beings? So if it's not required by law, because eventually you got to change law, I think you can simply, and it's more than just spoken word. This is because it has meaning. It has meaning. If you change every form that you have, where every time you see race, you put ethnicity as an example, that's going to move us forward. You might say, well, how does that really work? Trust me, it moves us forward, because then you can be opening up your mind to understanding the reason you racialize is because it was intentionally done to make sure that we maintain the caste system at a subconscious and explicit level. And if you listen to the debate, when then President Trump said there were good people on both sides, it shows you how it operates. It shows you how people cling to this, even though you're going to say, well, biological determinism is not fully the main thing. Yes, you might not see it, you might not feel it, but on the everyday person point of view, it's being practiced. So, practical terms, change your forms if you can. Practice if you're going to be less able to identify vulnerable youth or families. No, just use the more scientifically sound term, and that one I propose is ethnicity or ancestry or geographic origins, which again that's less acceptable to me, but go right ahead. In terms of anti-racist practices, a lot we can talk about in terms of what science tells us to do, in terms of what works best to help to heal and help people to grow in skills. That's different. What I'm talking about is one methodological practice that might make a difference. Try to practice just one day. One day, stop racializing people and being specific about their ethnic background. Just practice it in one conversation. Try to do it. I wrote a piece to the New York Times 3 years ago arguing this. Of course, they didn't take it. I get it. Who wants to be the one to say, I'm not saying racism doesn't matter. It matters a whole damn lot. I'm just saying, be more specific and let's undo one of the things that eugenicists, white supremacist scholars who advance in scientific racism, one of their victories, their biggest victory. Let's see if we can undo that just a little bit. I think it will make a difference.
Thank you. One of our colleagues, Courtney Cogburn, asked a really important question. How do we hold whiteness and white supremacy and anti-Blackness accountable without naming race?
Name racism. We have to stop equating race with racism. Racism, you got to think about what racism really is and was then. Racism was on the same level as genocide. You got to remember, if I go back to those slides, the idea of eugenicist thinking is that the inferior should not survive and do not belong in a modern society. What do we call that? When you want to get rid of a whole group. Then you constitute that, then you advance violence, and then you use that violence to maintain the caste system and hierarchy.
Excellent point. The next question, it just dropped down. Let's see. Sorry, these are things are moving quickly. Another question is around how does anti-Black racism or racism, white supremacy impact the mental health of Black people, in particular Black youth?
It's interesting because most Black youth, or particularly younger generation, again, for a variety of social reasons, they tend to want to obscure the idea of race, as they call it, because of the idea of any shame that might be associated with that for some. That they try to see the world as not, because they believe a little bit more that the world does not operate based on racism as much, and that has an impact. Now I'm getting a little bit more into some other work that has an impact on their internalizing behaviors and tendencies today, because they don't see the effect of racism as sharply, because again they're being taught not to see it, not that it doesn't exist in their lives.
Yeah. So some of our attendees are really interested in some of your longstanding work around suicide, and in particular, what is the reason for the rise of Black child suicide?
Well, one of the rational reasoning for me is that the developmental context of Black children have changed. Now you have generations of Black children who are not able to understand that their success is based on their own individual effort and the context that facilitates opportunity. So they have lost that understanding of the impact of context in facilitating their opportunity and the quality of life that they're experiencing. So then they tend to internalize more so than previous generations. And that's why younger and younger Blacks are more at risk for suicide than older Blacks. And that's why our chart for suicide, if you look at it, suicide is highest among Blacks under 35, not over 35.
So of course I have to ask you, what do you think the role of social media and technology is in this particular issue as well?
I see that's an empirical question, Dr. Patton, that we should really talk about.
Love it, love it. So another question is, the NIH requires reporting in terms of race in order to demonstrate their projects are not inequitably leaving out some people. How do we structurally challenge it at the federal level?
So that's an important part. So that you have to, again, this sort of stuff you got to do with great thought, because it has consequences, because we are codified into law, not for all the bad reasons that the eugenicists wanted, but also progressive thoughts. The idea is that how do you identify populations that's having unequal treatment, or being targeted, or being treated unfairly, or being treated well? You must have that tool. And so we have the tool. So it's in law that the federal government collects certain information. I'm not saying to eliminate that. I'm just saying to upgrade it to make sure it's scientifically sound. So we can still connect information on ethnicity. We can add more detailed information on skin color, but that's going to take a congressional level action. But you got to make the right proposals to be able to do that. Because again, as you know, still on those forms, ethnicity only means, do I speak Spanish or not? Why is that the definition of ethnicity? As if Italian Americans have no ethnic background? Dominican Americans have no ethnic background? So ethnicity in that context only means there's some history or lineage in your family that speaks Spanish, or origins from a country that speaks primarily Spanish. So I do think there's things we can do, but it takes our first practice is where it doesn't require federal change, but practice in your agencies, practice in your data collection as scientists, and being sound. And then I think then we can push for the other changes. But you got to be very careful not to support those who want to advance inequality in our society and hate.
So should the profession be advocating to eliminate the ideology of race?
No, see, my point is that the ideology of race is okay if you apply it according to its sound principles. That's not my point. My point is that they're not human races. They're human ethnic groups. There's human differences, skin color, all sorts of, abilities. But my point is, as a profession, as a society, I want to see the Society for Social Work and Research support sound scientific principles for measuring human diversity.
So we have a research question that follows up to that. So in a survey or interview or any other methodological practice, would you recommend asking participants to identify the ancestry they identify with, or ethnicity, or both, open-ended or with categories?
I love that, because now you as a scholar, you're deciding that that's more useful information and much more sound. I say you can do both. I say you can do both. You're just being very clear about what is it that you're trying to capture. And more important is your, and hate to be that faculty member for a second. We look at the underlining theoretical concepts that we're measuring. So if you use a variable, like even the same sort of thing around gender, you're saying, what is it that you're truly trying to capture or measure theoretically underneath? And then you create choices to say it represents or allows you to capture that. I'm just making sure that we're very clear that race, the concept you're trying to measure is that there's enough genetic variation between different groups of people that there are different races. And that's not possible right now. We have not found the evidence, even after the fully mapping of the human genome. We don't have it. It's not there. Otherwise, it'd be different subspecies of human beings. So because of that, then capture the social identities, the ethnic backgrounds, the ancestry. That's more specific, and it's actually giving you what you really want to measure.
So, in the algorithmic space, there are these contentious debates around whether or not racism is baked into the data or human. What does this mean for social work science and for those in particular that are doing secondary data analysis?
So this is a very practical question. I get to ask this one a lot. So for secondary data analysis, recode the data. Recode the data. Give it a stronger, appropriate conceptual meaning, and you can defend that. If you need a citation, this is one of the things we do at the Race and Opportunity Lab. Because people ask me, why is it the Race and Opportunity Lab? Because we're studying what happens with the concept of race and an impact. But you can recode the data. I don't think you're going to have a problem with that. You can justify that because of theoretically what was the variable trying to truly capture, right? And you can move forward in that way. And for data science, the bias, the literature is coming out, the bias is baked in. The racism or the biases are baked in. And again, what is it you're capturing? Rename it appropriately. And we do this all the time. We do this all the time. We used to talk about the term at some point was retarded populations. Not only for moral reasons, but we got more specific in our understanding about what is it in terms of level of ableness, right? People have. We do it all the time. But for some reason, we're stuck. Why are we stuck? That's what I'm trying to get at. It's intention. We don't have to be stuck. We have methodology that we're not applying. And I cite in my talk detention for folks. Race/ethnicity. Really? You see it. Please tell me your race/ethnicity. So you're equating these two? Really? No, it's not appropriate.
But some of our attendees are also pushing back against this idea of just focusing on ethnicity when we can also consider issues of colonialism and cultural appropriation within that particular category as well. So are there...
Sorry, you got to unpack that. I can understand what your words mean, but I don't know what they really mean. So I don't play that game. Let's be specific here. So what is the critique, and what is it that they would like to offer?
Yeah. Let me ask you the question directly. It says, so how does focusing solely on ethnicity work when it comes to a colonialism and cultural appropriation, when cultures are often stripped because of people deciding to falsely represent or occupy that which is usurped?
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the way the question is framed, meaning that we know colonialism happened. That's how you got Africans in the Caribbean, as an example. Okay, and we know there was interbreeding and mixing between the indigenous that was there, the Africans, and the colonizers, right? So out of that was born different cultures, right? My family's from Guyana, so I know this experience, right? But I'm proud to be able to talk about my Guyanese culture. I'm proud to be able to talk about my Brooklyn culture because we're our own planet by ourselves. You know? Um, and I'm proud to talk about neighborhood, all these other social identities. So I just think it's a very practical and useful term, and it doesn't come ripe or pregnant with all the historical
Sure.
racism that the word race comes with. And on top of that, it's not scientifically sound to use it because there's no proven subspecies of human beings that's currently existing today.
Got it.
I don't know if that gets at it. I don't see a problem with ethnicity. Ethnicity might not capture all, but my point is be specific. If you want to talk about skin color and colorism, measure skin color and colorism.
Got it. So our colleague Kathy Shear asked, so what exactly is the proposal for replacing the term race? It makes a huge amount of sense to do this, and NIMH has had conferences addressing this issue for decades. So how do we get there? And if there's no easy answer to this, who is working on developing it? And is there a working group? Are you doing it?
Well, I am doing it in my club and in other ways to try to do this with journals. I do think is for SWIR, for the Society for Social Work and Research, I will elevate it as a presidential initiative, and then we'll be able to pull a working group together. I know there's been conversations, but no attempt to do anything at NIH level. I know there's been excellent work. Carmen Jones, APH, a lot of scholars have picked this up, so it's not new. But what I'm adding that is new is that the argument that it's very clear that it's an argument around scientific rigor. It's an argument around the data to understand what race really means, and to understand if you ever have enough data to show that there's subspecies, then you're going to have to roll with it. But the point is the data is not there. That's the point that I don't think has been in the previous debates and discussions. And then the question is, what do you replace it with? I say you replace it with as many of the factors that you're trying to measure. One of the things we used to do in this work early on, and I'm guilty because, again, I came through all of this. We used to say, well, we know that there's some factors about race that matters. Now we got to figure out what really is it about race that matters. I'm saying now we can free ourselves from using that proxy and really talk about conceptually what we're trying to understand in terms of human differences and get specific. We have great scholars on colorism. We got great scholars on ancestry. We got great scholars on ethnic identity or social identities. We're going to have to add more variables to unpack the scientific racism that we've been swallowing, or to release us from that.
It sounds like, a part of your argument in terms of scientific rigor is in the language that we use to define these categories as well. But also, I think many of the questions that are coming through are around like what is the underlying work that needs to happen in our training and practice? Without those underlying shifts, do we risk not using race becoming hollow or symbolic?
And I know it takes a little while because there's some there's always this cognitive dissonance in this conversation, and I appreciate this because, again, I keep saying the same thing as if it's going to be new, but I keep saying it, and I understand this. Trust me, I've been through this. People say, well, how do I do this in a practical way? I was talking to a colleague of mine, not a scholar but very bright, and of course contributes quite a bit to our school, and she was like, well, I'm just having a hard time with it. I was like, well, you can still be black people. It's okay, but it's not your race. It could be a social identity. Let me put it another way. We're very clear. If I tell you to measure depression, you're going to want to know what is the definition of depression. Then we're going to say, well, what are the words people use to express their depressive symptoms? And how does that vary by different groups? But what we're trying not to debate is we try to get a common consensus about what do we mean by depression in order to do that. I'm making the same sort of argument about what do we mean by human diversity. And it's time, and folks, I have 16 books that we've read, and they've all been saying the same thing, providing great insight about what we should be doing. What's not happening is that we're not teaching this information, and two, we're not We haven't set standards for this, and we're not adhering to those standards. So we can make the shift. It's just many have been taught the wrong research practice. And I'm guilty. I came out of this. And it's not going to change overnight, but it's changeable with some practical things that we do. You got to teach this history. You got to help people understand what the right concept is and what is it they're truly trying to measure. And then you have to give them alternatives so they can use that properly. What are the right alternatives they can consider? And we can set these sort of standards.
Does your approach or thinking at all change when applied to systems and institutions like child welfare or, the juvenile justice system?
No, unless human beings change. We're talking about classifying human beings. So if you're working with human beings, it applies no matter what you're studying.
Absolutely. And switching topics a little bit, I mean, I think that some of our attendees are like, the new millennia, our younger folk don't see race, right? So like, why, do you believe that, younger folk have a different conceptualization of race? And is it due to access to technology or other types of interactions that us older folk don't have?
It's kind of interesting. We taught them to believe what they believe. We as a society, we teach them. So, and it's not all, but it's most. So I remember there was a show that Ice Cube did many, many years ago. I never forgot this show. And he was looking at young whites and young blacks. And if they really just show anecdotally that young whites and young blacks thought the same about society they believed in the American meritocracy. We're only going to get as far as what my skills and talent. Oh, Dad, that's your era. This issue about racism, that was your era. That's not where we are now. So they believed in this, which is not a bad thing to believe, but it's bad in the sense of like this. When we're dealing with abused children, we try to make sure they understand what is and what is not their fault. So how are you going to raise a child in today's society telling them that just their own effort alone is going to get them far, as if there's nothing structural that will get in their way? As if hate would never try to keep them in some type of hierarchy or social class, or that they might not be thought of as uppity, or if they interact with law enforcement officers, that they don't feel they can ask a law enforcement officer, and the officer says, you can't ask me nothing, you just do what I told you. That's not how the whole world supposed to operate. And there's differences, right? But what's operating there is, again, caste, racism, violence, and you can give them the language to help them understand their experiences. So agency matters, and our kids have great agency. That's how we continue to survive. I get that. But at the same time, I got young children, and I try to tell them, listen, work your behind off. Family mantra is Joe's work hard. You ask, even the youngest. But at the same time, again, I help them to understand there are going to be those who are going to treat you different just because you look different. That doesn't mean you have to consume or retaliate in the same level that they might, act towards you. But at the same time, I don't want them believing that there is no one who's going to put up barriers that is racism based. I don't want them to assume that, because then they're going to interpret everything as this, well, if I didn't succeed, it's just my fault. And that's the basic ethos that we've been pushing, as part of the Reaganomics era, which I remember coming through, the idea of individual accountability and responsibility, good in terms, yes, but there's also structural racism that operates. And if you don't believe that, just keep watching the news and watch this case going on in the killing of George Floyd. Watch how it goes down.
So I think my last question is going to be about the work of your lab moving forward, because a lot of the questions are like, folks are just hungry to apply this to their particular issue or population, right? So folks are looking at cancer, they're looking at juvenile justice, they're looking at child welfare. They're like, teach me how to do this. And so I'm wondering if you could talk to us about the work of the lab and kind of how you may operationalize this so that many different types of people can use this and do this moving forward?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're beginning to do, and we're going to have, because we have a researcher and resiliency training for scholars of African descent that is done. It's a NIMH 25. So we're doing a workshop this summer that we're going to do around this, and teaching that group about how do they apply this information and the practice and the principles. And then I'm hoping to finish, this article just to get out the primer and just how do you use this. But I do think it requires a good working group. And right now my current journal club is a lot of neuroscientists and folks, and they're not getting involved, and we're talking about this. So that's what the lab is trying to do, and I'm just trying to get together with those who are interested in figuring out. And my principle is this: I need people in different disciplines to join us so they can write about what it means for their discipline, because the implications and the practice are slightly different. But I do think we'll be able to have a rich conversation, not this year, but I'm hoping not this SWOR coming up, the Society for Social Work and Research, but after that. And then my goal is to commission, a group, and I would like that to be interdisciplinary just by the nature of my profession and my topic. I deal with psychologists, and many people look at mental health, that I think we can do something significant around this. And I would want to build that in a way that's proper. Now, part of the challenge is this. Yeah, it took me 6 years to decide even to share this with a group. We got to be careful with this. This is not just running out and just, throwing things out, because you can quickly find yourself in that debate, which the earlier work got caught up in, well, we don't see race. And I was like, no, see, because you playing the trick. That's racecraft. You're trying to equate race and racism. No, I'm saying you're going to see racism because it's real, but let's really measure what we're trying to measure and set some standards for review, standards for journal review, standards for grant reviews. We know how to do this.
Dr. Joe, thank you so very much for this wonderful presentation and your thoughtful responses to the Q&A. We're so happy to have you at Columbia Social Work with us tonight. I'm going to turn it back over to Dean Begg. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Joe and Dr. Patton, thank you for a great start to our lecture series on ethnicity and racism. I'm honored that you chose to share this thinking with us, Dr. Joe. It really is wonderful. It was a fascinating presentation, and what a pleasure for all of us to witness back and forth between two long-term colleagues dedicated to social and racial justice. So that was part of the pleasure as well. And it was exciting to hear your discourse around disrupting how we use data and how we should be thinking differently about teaching social work science. So we're all walking away from this with a lot to chew over. And the other thing I just wanted to mention, I was fascinated when you said there was this campaign to, conscious campaign to introduce race into our consciousness. So that means there can be a campaign to reverse that, right? So we can go there. Thank you for that. Thank you for that inspiration, and thanks to everyone for joining us. It's been spectacular. Dr. Joe, would you like to say anything to close us out, or?
Oh no, I was just saying thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to join, and let's be careful in how we move this work forward. But again, I look forward to working with as many people as possible to move this forward. So thank you.
It's terrific. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.